And we begin with breaking news out of Los Angeles, where protests are continuing for a fourth day over the Trump administration's immigration policies, with the White House deploying the military to crack down on demonstrations in a situation that shows few signs of calming. You're looking right now at live pictures of one confrontation right now between demonstrators and police at a local intersection. Now, some of the protests have turned violent, with agitators setting fire to driverless cars and looting local businesses. Authorities are reporting that they've made at least 56 arrests. President Trump today calling those protesters insurrectionists, while suggesting that his border czar Tom Homan should consider arresting California Governor Gavin Newsom.
Gavin Newsom he's daring Tom Homan to come and arrest him. Should he do it?
I would do it if I were Tom. I think it's great. Gavin likes the publicity, but I think it would be a great thing. The people that are causing the problem are professional agitators. They're insurrectionists. They're bad people. They should be in jail.
Now, it was a bit hard to hear over the rotor wash of the Marine One helicopter, but it's possible the president also said, "I think he's great," referring to his border czar Tom Homan. Still, Newsom responded on social media, tweeting that the president's remarks were, as he called it, an unmistakable step toward authoritarianism. Moments ago, at an event at the White House, the president was asked by reporters what crime Newsom has committed. He responded that Newsom's crime was that he ran for governor, which is obviously not a crime. Now, despite his previous threats to arrest anyone who interferes with his operations, Homan says he's not ready to arrest California's governor or Los Angeles' mayor.
When he asked the questions that include Mayor Bassett, Governor Newsom, I was clear, they haven't crossed the line, but they're not above the law either. If they commit a crime, they certainly will ask for prosecution. That's what was happening. I never threatened to arrest Governor Newsom.
Close to 300 National Guard members, meanwhile, are on the ground right now in Los Angeles after the president once again invoked emergency powers and ordered the deployment of 2,000 troops over the weekend without the state's consent. About 500 Marines are also ready to deploy, the president defending that decision yesterday.
Well, we're going to have troops everywhere. We're not going to let this happen to our country. We're not going to let our country be torn apart like it was under Biden and his auto pen.
And California's Attorney General today making good on his promise to challenge the president's deployment of the National Guard, suing the administration. It comes after Newsom accused the president of escalating tensions for his own political benefit.
But Donald Trump needs to pull back. He needs to stand down. Donald Trump is inflaming these conditions. This is Donald Trump's problem right now. He made this up. This is a manufactured crisis in order to get under the tent to start to stretch credulity.
NBC News correspondent David Noriega joins me from Los Angeles. Also with me is NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez. And let's start with you, David. What is the situation like on the ground right now in Los Angeles? And are officials taking any precautions ahead of tonight?
Yeah, Ryan, so the reason you see me looking over there is because actually just in the last couple of minutes, this small group of protesters arrived here on the street that leads towards the federal building where the National Guard troops have been stationed for the last day. It's a small group, as you can see, but they seem relatively fired up. They are kind of walking out into the intersection here. It's a fairly big intersection downtown of Alameda and Aliso streets. And they were just, there was a small group of protesters throwing plastic water bottles at some police vehicles that were trying to enter the street here towards the federal building. We're seeing the same thing here happening right now. We've got some protesters hitting the outside of this law enforcement van. A few different actually law enforcement SUVs pulling into the street right now. Some armored vehicles you're going to see drive by shortly as well. As you can see, you've got some PD, some LAPD as well with rubber rounds, rubber bullets pointed at the protesters, ordering them to move. This is as much action as we've seen today, Ryan, and it started literally in the last 5 to 10 minutes. So that here, let me explain to you a little bit spatially how it is that this works right now. Alan, if I could actually have you just pan very quickly over towards the National Guard troops, if you can see them, because down that block where you see these vehicles, these police vehicles coming in, That is the federal building right in front of the Metropolitan Detention Center where these National Guard troops are stationed. Over the course of the last hour or so, they've started coming out in larger numbers. As you can see, they have their riot shields out, their batons out, all of their riot gear is out. So they seem to be prepared for further confrontations with protesters. Right now, I will say the number of protesters is small, Ryan. It's nowhere near the numbers that we saw yesterday that led to those really striking images that you saw with the Waymos being set on fire, with people throwing, rocks and other projectiles at police. Look, this could go. This is just beginning, right? It's only 1 o'clock in LA. It's been a quiet morning. That seems to be starting to change at this moment, but really it depends on how many protesters decide to show up at this very intersection, the point where we are right now, and how confrontational they decide to become with the police, and how quick the police are to deploy those less lethal munitions, Ryan, those crowd control measures that, sort of led to the escalation that we saw yesterday between protesters and police. Ryan, back to you.
And President Trump has called this an insurrection. He's called it a rebellion. And it's probably important to keep in mind, too, that there have been different protests throughout the city, throughout the area, to varying degrees of violence, most of them being predominantly peaceful. How would you describe the situation? You're the one on the ground. What does it seem like to you?
I mean, Ryan, it's unrest. I've covered many protests in the United States throughout the years and in other countries. I've seen protests that have gotten a lot more violent, a lot more intense, a lot more, actual riots. I would not describe this as a riot. There's property damage. As often happens in protests like this, there's a relatively small group of protesters who, as a tactic, as a sort of conscious tactic, this is something that they do, that they engage in deliberately and intentionally. They do things like set fire to Waymos. They do things like throw projectiles at police vehicles, etc. Again, this is a small group of people who are engaged in property damage as part of much larger mobilizations that are largely peaceful, that do sometimes do things like block intersections, even after LAPD declares them unlawful assemblies. Yesterday, they blocked the 101. As we're seeing this group of protesters here today, attempting to block this intersection as well. Just blocks away from me, I was actually just there before I came here for this live hit, Ryan. There's a 100% entirely peaceful, organized, very polite protest put together by the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union. You had some pictures of that up on the screen just a minute ago. That's what you're seeing right there with these aerials. That is in Grand Park, 100% peaceful, 100% organized, keeping people to the park. Look, there's always a variety of different people employing different tactics. Look, this is unrest. Los Angeles has definitely seen much worse in the past. I do just want to show you, my cameraman just pointed out to me that some LAPD riot control units are moving towards this group of protesters at the intersection. They are carrying some specific types of less lethal munitions. They're rubber rounds. They're 40-millimeter rubber rounds. What they do is they skip them at the ground towards protesters, towards their feet, and then have them bounce up towards protesters as a way of dispersing the crowds. Obviously, the fact that they're showing up with them doesn't mean that they're going to use them. We'll have to see if that happens or not in the next few minutes. The last thing I'll point out to you, Ryan, before I toss it back to you, there's a very clear distinction here between the National Guard troops that are all the way back there in front of the federal building with DHS and other federal security forces and the local police department who are doing really the bulk of the crowd control work here. Yesterday, there were some direct confrontations between the National Guard troops and protesters. That is no longer the case, and that is because local law enforcement is keeping a pretty wide perimeter around the area where the troops are stationed and preventing any protesters from getting there, again, by forcibly repelling them with less lethal, rubber rounds, foam rounds. There was some tear gas yesterday. Have not seen any tear gas yet today, but that is sort of where things have been escalating to over the last 24, 48 hours, Ryan.
Yeah, and obviously this is an evolving situation, but I wonder if you can tell from the protesters that you've talked to, are they clued in? As we do, if something happens, please sure to flag it to us. But
I'll let you know.
Yeah. Do you find that they're clued into what's being said by the president and the governor? This back and forth, the threats to arrest the governor. Is that something that's has reached this level of the protest, and is it having an impact on their decision making?
I think some protesters who are, sort of the more engaged in the more sort of organized, the ones who belong to institutions, organizations like labor unions, those people are paying attention to that kind of talk. I think they do think of themselves and the organizations that they belong to as more, sort of chess pieces on this political board. They think about the optics of this. Other protesters, like the group that we're seeing here, Alan, I don't know if you can pan over there again just so that we can have a visual about what we're talking about. There are, with any protest like this, you have to think about the groups of people who are protesting as diverse, as a sort of diverse coalition. They're not always necessarily organized amongst themselves, but there are always smaller groups of protesters who are much more willing to be confrontational, to engage in things like property damage, and are willing to sort of instigate these kinds of encounters with law enforcement. I will note, though, at this point, we do seem to have a front line of what appear to be clergy members at the front of this particular group of protesters who are forming a line at the very front of this group between the protesters behind them and the police. So, look, there's really no end to the diversity of the protesters that you see. The point that I was getting at, Ryan, is that the protesters who I think are a little bit more raucous, more likely to get engaged in that kind of more confrontational behavior, the ones that I've spoken to, they don't tend to be particularly concerned with the sort of, higher level political optics of this. They are angry. A lot of them are involved in other causes. A lot of them are carrying, things like Palestinian flags and keffiyehs. They have some of the signage that has somewhat more, ice out of LA. They tend to hold more radical positions. Some of them describe themselves as anarchists, etc. These are the people who I think are sort of likely to, inflame things in these sorts of encounters, intentionally inflame things. I don't think they would back away from that assertion or from that characterization. And they are different, I will say, in this particular instance from you're seeing, they are different from the clergy who have lined up directly in front of them, in front of the police. They're different from the union members that you're seeing, 2 or 3 blocks away at Grand Park. We often see these different sort of elements of protest converge in the same place. Again, this is a pretty small group, Ryan. I'm not, we'd need aerials to really start estimating a crowd, but maybe 100 people roughly here at this intersection right now. It might grow over the course of the next few hours. That's really what's going to determine how, how heated things get here, Ryan.
And I also wonder too, David, you're talking about different law enforcement agencies that answer to different levels of authority. And in some cases, those levels of authority are in conflict, right? Those police officers that are standing behind you, their chain of command comes from the mayor's office, right? These National Guard troops got their marching orders from the White House. Are they able to work together, I guess, is the question, despite having perhaps maybe different messaging coming from their leadership?
It's a really good question, Ryan, and it's a really unusual situation that you have LAPD responding to the mayor. Yesterday you had California Highway Patrol responding to the governor, essentially protecting the federal building and the National Guard troops from keeping protesters from reaching them, even though at the higher levels between the president and the governor themselves, they are in conflict. I will tell you, the conflict between the actual elected officials, the president and the governor, I think is a little bit more pointed, a little bit more clear. There is no conflict like that between the law enforcement and security forces that we're seeing here on the ground. We have DHS vehicles pulling into this street, being protected by LAPD officers who are the ones holding the line, preventing protesters from reaching the place where DHS and National Guard troops are stationed. So even though it's an unusual situation, even though the National Guard is here against the wishes of the governor, even though the National Guard is here, contravening the wishes of the governor and facing criticism from the mayor as well for their presence here, nevertheless, you see coordination on the ground between local police, LAPD, who are doing, again, the lion's share, the vast majority, I would say at this point, pretty much all of the crowd control work in preventing people from being able to reach the National Guard troops and the federal security for the federal agents that are, around the middle of this block here behind me, Ryan.
Okay, David, do us a favor. You guys, first of all, stay safe, but we're going to keep you connected to us and stand by. If something pops up, please flag it to us and let us know. We'll go to immediately. But let's turn to Gabe now at the White House, where he has some breaking news about the situation and the response from the federal government. Gabe, what can you tell us?
Hi there, Ryan. Well, this could be interpreted to be a significant escalation here. According to 2 defense officials telling our Pentagon team, approximately 700 active duty troops, 700 Marines, have just been mobilized to support the National Guard in Los Angeles County. That is is temporary until more National Guard troops arrive. Now, this is significant, Ryan. Again, this would be 700 Marines, not just National Guard troops. President Trump was asked about this just a few minutes ago at a roundtable we had here at the White House. He was asked directly whether that would happen, and he said, quote, "We'll see what happens." Now, short time before that, I spoke with a White House official that said that no final decision had been made, but if those Marines are sent there, that they would be sent there to simply protect ICE agents that are already on the ground. Now, Ryan, as you know, this comes after over the weekend, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that it was possible that active duty Marines could be sent to the area from nearby Camp Pendleton. At that point, it was simply a threat. The president did not make any commitment one way or the other. But again, now the breaking news, we are learning that according to two defense officials, approximately 700 Marines have been mobilized to head to the area. Again, that is temporary until more National Guard troops arrive. We're waiting for any more updated word from the White House of what led to this. But it is an escalation as the administration monitors these protests and sees if they continue tonight and over the next couple of days, Ryan.
And Gabe, it seems that the White House is comfortable leaning into this situation. And we now know that they're willing to send Marines in to deal with this. How much further could they potentially escalate the federal government's involvement in Los Angeles?
Well, as one White House official told me earlier today, quote, "We are happy to have this fight." Not that they want to see violence on the ground in American cities, but that they view it as a fight that they want to have politically because blue cities, they, in their view, are not doing enough to protect law and order. And they see this as a mandate that they were given by their voters to have this immigration crackdown continue really throughout the country. So certainly they are leaning into it. You just heard it from the president in his comments a few moments ago, leaning into that criticism of Governor Gavin Newsom, calling him incompetent. And significantly, Ryan, it was just several years ago, back in 2020, that the president made comments suggesting that he recognized that he needed authorization from his state's governor before he sent in the National Guard. This is, of course, the first time since the 1960s, 1965, the Civil Rights era, that a president has sent in a National Guard over the objection of that state's governor. However, this is something that President Trump in a different form has done before. Back in 2020 in Portland, Oregon, for example, it wasn't the National Guard, but he sent in federal agents in order to quell protests there. So this is something the administration is very comfortable with, as you said, leaning into this because they see it as a winning political issue. Wow.
All right, let's go back to David on the ground there in Los Angeles. And David, you're hearing this news just like we are, that Gabe's reporting that those Marines have been given the word to deploy. How do you think that will be received on the ground where you are to see this escalation, first the National Guard and now actually U.S. Marines on the ground there in Los Angeles?
Ryan, it's without question an escalation. What I can tell you is that yesterday, the presence of the National Guard troops here was a major factor in escalating the protests that we saw and the degree and the intensity of the confrontation between the protesters and law enforcement. You know, when they were allowing us access back there, I was there all morning yesterday, and protesters were very clearly very angry at the fact that the National Guard troops were here. And then it was the local law enforcement efforts to move protesters away from that specific location. Multiple protests from different points of the city converged here, and that's what led LAPD and other local law enforcement agencies to push them away. That's what led to those confrontations with protesters. That was just on the presence, based on the presence of the National Guard, obviously federalized against the wishes of the governor. But escalating this to active duty Marines is a major escalation. Protesters here are not going to take kindly to that. Any of the protests, I described to you a sort of range of protesters, from people willing to engage in confrontational behavior to people who will only, march peacefully and politely. I think that entire range of protesters is not going to be happy about this. And just that news is likely to inflame tensions. And I will say, Ryan, for what it's worth, today compared to yesterday, things were much quieter, much more orderly today compared to what they were yesterday. So it's a little bit puzzling to me, just based on my perspective on the ground, why it would be necessary to send active duty Marines at this moment. There are no riots happening, nothing's on fire. Yesterday, there were, things that you might plausibly describe as riot behavior. There were things on fire. That is not the case today. So I'm not sure why, after things quieted down, after things calmed down substantially, again, just reporting what I'm seeing on the ground, I'm not sure why that is the moment that the decision is made to deploy Marines. I think it speaks to some of the things that we've been hearing from Gabe and Yamiche and other folks at the White House today, that this has a lot to do with the optics, it has a lot to do with the politics, and that is in some ways disconnected from the reality of what is actually happening on the ground here in Los Angeles. Ryan.
Okay, David, you continue to stand by. If there is any news, please flag it to our control room. Gabe Gutierrez, we appreciate your reporting from the White House.